In this lecture, we examine the period running from the Renaissance through the 17th century Age of Reason. And we'll first look at some of the historical context in which philosophy developed in this period. Then we'll look at what are really probably the two most important moments in this period, philosophically speaking, the Renaissance in South and North Europe, then the Age of Reason associated with the rationalists, Descartes and others, and then finally some concluding remarks about the seminal role of Sir Isaac Newton and his work in bringing to a close the Age of Reason and ushering in the famed 18th century Enlightenment. So let's begin talking a bit about the transformation of Europe from the close of the 15th to the close of the 17th centuries. This was an epoch in which Latin Christendom was fundamentally transformed. It is, in fact, the period which marks the end of the feudal epoch and the medieval period, and really the birth of our modern age. And there are a host of different developments which really mark and signalize this transformation. And as we'll see over the remainder of the course, from this period on, modernity is characterized in the West by an increasing rate of change, development, and transformation. Well, the end of the 15th century, as we know, marked the beginning of the Age of Discovery. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and in so doing, fundamentally transformed Europeans' understanding of the world. Learning that there was a new world changed dramatically the way Europeans thought of their position on the globe. That, coupled with the circumnavigation of the globe, brought Europeans into contact with peoples and cultures with profoundly different beliefs, different practices, and values. And it was this exposure to different cultures, whether in the Americas, in Africa, or the East Indies, which challenged Europeans to both account for their own views and defend their own views, as well as to account for the views of those outsiders or strangers. And indeed, we'll see, if you read Montaigne and certainly Montesquieu, the idiom of travel tales becomes an important way in which Europeans judge themselves relative to that of other cultural traditions. And we'll see this is also true of Thomas More's Utopia, for example, which is a travel story. But it wasn't just learning about other cultures and their existence. The circumnavigation of the globe and the creation of a global world for the first time led to an accelerated transfer of technologies and ideas. It is in this period when Europe develops a highly efficient use of block printing, initiated by Gutenberg, the development of cannonry, ballistics, military technologies, the compass, most of which technologies actually come from China and reach Europe through the Middle East, development of paper, a whole host of technological advances which would become part of the European toolkit and help facilitate their mastery of the globe. Well, the Age of Discovery also heralded an age of commerce. And there are really two dimensions to this age of commerce. One is within Europe itself. The rate of commerce dramatically expands. More and more people find themselves connected to markets. But most famously, the age of commerce extends between Europe and the entire rest of the inhabited world. Particularly northwestern Europe becomes part of what some scholars have called the first world system, in which commodities are produced for global exchange. Spices from the East are exchanged for metals from the Americas. Textiles from Northern Europe are exported to East Asia and, of course, the New World as well. And a whole host of new consumer goods, tastes, and commodities become an important part of the European economic scene. Gold, and especially silver, from the New World fueled a dramatic price revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries, where the prices of goods doubled in northwestern Europe. And this led to the development of most of our modern mechanisms of financial capitalism. The bill of exchange, set interest rates, and modern state financing all begins in this period. So in many ways, it's the birth of our modern commercial capitalist society. And one of the results of that was that really for the first time, large numbers of Europeans were tapped into long-distance trade networks. There had been long-distance trade before the Renaissance, but it had primarily concerned luxury goods, which were imported for the elites of Europe. It's in this period when consumption of foreign goods becomes fairly common throughout all of the, not only the elite, but broad strata of the middle classes and even some of the laboring classes. Even more importantly, production, even that of the production of peasants and craftsmen, becomes increasingly geared to international markets and international competition, which produces both the disruptions we know are associated with the business cycle, which first rears its ugly head in Europe, but also prods constant technological innovation, which first emerges in textiles and then will spread to other industries. Okay. So far we've seen the age of discovery and the age of commerce. But accompanying the commercial revolutions was a concurrent demographic revolution. Populations of northwestern Europe doubled at the same time, forcing an economy of resources and a redeployment of labor sources. And with it came the emergence of the early territorial nation-state, that form of political association with which we are now intensely associated. And this came from the age of discovery and the age of commerce. For the modern nation-state was financed by tax revenues that were exacted on this growing commerce, which allowed princes to finally ignore the military contributions of their barons and use funds to hire professional mercenary armies. It was these growing tax revenues which allowed territorial princes to absolutize their powers, which is to say, to centralize their authority and bureaucratize their administration. And of course we have famous examples of this. In France, the rise of the Sun King, Louis XIV, whose absolute and centralized administration became a model for all competing monarchs of Europe. It also, however, produced sometimes reactive tendencies. And again, here the classic example is that of Stuart England, where when the Stuart monarchs, first Charles I and then later Charles II and his brother James II, tried to introduce, quote, arbitrary and absolute measures, they did nothing so much as produce a parliamentary revolt on the part of the propertied and particularly landed classes, which resulted in the subsequent rise of the House of Commons and the emergence of the mixed monarchy or mixed republic, which we associate 18th and 19th century Great Britain with. Finally, and perhaps most unfortunately, these centuries were also characterized by a series of intense confessional struggles, religious wars between the Catholic nations and the emerging Protestant nations and churches. We think of the 30 Years' War, the various struggles of the Dutch for independence. These struggles were peculiarly bloody. They were perhaps the most bloody and destructive wars Europe faced, certainly before the Napoleonic War, possibly even before the First World War. And the virulence with which they were fought by all combatants, Protestants as well as Catholics, ultimately resulted, as we'll see in the late 17th century and then in the Enlightenment, a reaction against such confessional struggles, which created a strong commitment to religious toleration and quietism in the following generations. Okay, that's the sort of historical context or backdrop to the epoch. Philosophically, the age is opened by the famous Renaissance. And by Renaissance, we mean a rebirth, and in this case, a rebirth of classical learning and art, associated with figures like Petrarch, Giordano Bruno, and most famously Niccolo Machiavelli in the South, this rebirth was a self-conscious rejection of tradition, in particular of the tradition of medieval scholasticism and its obvious Aristotelianism. In lieu of such scholasticism, the Renaissance argued for a reemergence of a humanist worldview, a worldview which claimed that man was indeed the measure of the world, that man was indeed a noble creation, as exemplified in the famous lines from Shakespeare, "What a noble work of man." What a noble work is man, I should say. And it is critical to note that it took the Renaissance to allow us to re-embrace humanism from under the shadow of Augustinian piety, and with it the suggestion that man is a fallen creature, a sinful and evil creature that had dominated Latin Christendom for at least a millennia. Now, there was an obvious tension between such Renaissance classicism, such an embrace of the ancient Roman and Greek past, and traditional Christianity. Their values were obviously in many ways antithetical, and it is quite clear that the Renaissance, in embracing pagans, intended that to be a rebuke to the Christian tradition. This is particularly clear in regards to ethical and metaphysical doctrines. And indeed, we might note that for most of the Renaissance, there is an embrace of ancient pagan cosmologies and worldviews instead of the traditional Judeo-Christian view of things. And we'll see this is true both in terms of the humanistic disciplines and the sciences. Well, it is traditional to demarcate at least two phases of the Renaissance, a southern or Italian phase and a northern phase. The southern or Italian Renaissance was dominated by the figures I've already mentioned, Petrarch, Bruno, and of course Niccolo Machiavelli, and a host of lesser figures like Guicciardini and others. In many ways, the Southern Renaissance was characterized by a much more unflinching embrace of classical humanism. And in that way, it was actually much more hostile to Christian ethical, political, and scientific teachings. And as we'll see in Machiavelli, the virtues and real virtues of his principe or leader are clearly not Christian virtues. They are classical pagan virtues, the classic cardinal virtues that a Greek or Roman would have understood and respected. And there is a sense in which Machiavelli clearly thinks that Christian values rob a political leader of his manhood, of his virulence, of his virtù. By way of contrast, the Northern Renaissance was far more pietistic. Indeed, one might think of the Reformation as an early Northern Renaissance, a rebirth not of classical learning, but of the apostolic Christian tradition. But even those who did embrace classicism, the true Renaissance figures of the North, like More and Erasmus, sought to unify classical learning with the social ethic of Christianity, while nonetheless rejecting the scholastic inheritance, which makes them clearly part of that overall Renaissance tradition. For example, in his Utopia, Thomas More sought to show the fundamental affinity, that he saw at least, between the social teachings of Christ, as contained in the Beatitudes, the notion that the meek shall inherit the earth, that blessed are the peacemakers, and those of Plato in the Republic. Like Plato, More embraces communism. But unlike Plato, and here it becomes the Christian element, he insists that a just political order must also be based on a belief in the immortality of the soul and divine punishment and reward. And here again we see the ideal of a Christian humanism. Similarly, in Erasmus, we see Erasmus critique the enthusiasm and dogmatism of Reformed scholasticism, the sort of theological rumination associated with the Protestant Reformation, in his case most specifically that of Martin Luther. In its stead, he urged a far more humanistic concern, a concern focusing on good works and a commitment to religious toleration, as opposed to dogmatism and confessional struggle. Finally, I want to look briefly at the scientific Renaissance, which would have profound impact on the course of 17th century thought. The scientific Renaissance also rejected the scholastic tradition. It rejected the presumed authority and sanction of scholastic disputation and its fusion of revealed dogma with Aristotelian metaphysics. For example, Francis Bacon characterized the scholastic inheritance as one of the, quote, idols of the mind. Scholasticism for him was a source of error that alienated us from an understanding of nature, that precluded our penetration of nature's greatest mysteries. And instead, he argued for a modern science, a new science, as it were, that would produce not theorems and scholiums, not arguments and disputations, but useful practical knowledge. And it would do so not by appealing to the authority of the great philosopher Aristotle or through logical disputation, but instead by means of observation and induction, an induction from particulars that was challenged and tested by means of experimentation. So instead of university disputation, the model of science now becomes organized around the observation of nature and the laboratory as a site of experimental testing. Such a science, in Bacon's mind, would be both cumulative, in that it would grow over time, and cooperative as a venture. And it's this combination of cumulative growing knowledge and cooperation among scientists examining nature which would achieve for him the humanistic goal, the goal of giving man power over his natural environment, of making man the master of his world, and in that way he would indeed be the measure of all things. Well, similarly, Galileo also rejected both the scholastic and scriptural inheritances, argued that neither Aristotle nor the Bible should have any role in deliberations concerning matters of science. And I mentioned the importance of the classical tradition in giving this sort of liberation to scientists. For Galileo, it was Pythagoras. Galileo was a neo-Pythagorean. And it was from his Pythagoreanism that Galileo was able to claim that, quote, nature is the book of God, and that it is written in the language of mathematics. And Galileo's work clearly looks in both directions here, forward to mathematized physics, and backward to that Pythagorean ideal of a world which is modeled by means of mathematics and arithmetic. But there is also a clearly pietistic, but humanistic and classically pietistic orientation here. For Galileo is saying that, in effect, nature is God's second revelation, and that science is a sort of priestcraft, which reveals to us God's will as expressed in the mathematical formulas with which his creation is embodied. And Galileo used this stress on the quantitative rather than the qualitative, both in his understanding of scientific discourse and in his own analysis of nature, to draw what would emerge as a critical metaphysical distinction for the 17th century, that between primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are those qualities that Galileo claimed objects really have in and of themselves. And those qualities, you'll see, are all mechanical, quantitative, and objective. They are things like an object has a particular mass, a particular shape, a particular volume. It moves at a particular rate. In contrast, the secondary qualities are all purely qualitative. And they are, of course, the Aristotelian qualities. These refer to the entelechies of things, the purposes by which they work. Put simply, they would be things like the hardness or softness of an object, its colors, its flavors, all of which Galileo would claim are the result of our perception of the object, but are not part of the object itself. Color occurs in our interaction with an object, but that object itself simply has mass and emits energy of a certain wavelength. Now, Galileo didn't get to that point, but that's where his argument was headed. And it's that viewpoint, that distinction, would have immense influence in the following 2 centuries. both with regards to scientific speculation and the development of mechanics, which would reach its fruition in the path-breaking work of of Newton, but also in the formulation of metaphysics, specifically the metaphysic of materialism. Okay. Now, the second epoch is that associated with the 17th century, known as the Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason is labeled that because it really marks the birth of modern philosophy, a philosophy which does not need, or feel the need at least, to claim authority from the ancients. And such modern philosophy, in fact, does have its own unique problems and issues that we don't find addressed in the medieval or even classical period. The thought of this age is characterized, for example, by a thoroughgoing rejection of all received authorities. Religious authorities, scholastic authorities, revealed authorities, and even classical authorities. It is also subject to a growing awareness of the tensions between, on the one hand, the rational philosophic speculation which makes up the Age of Reason, and the traditional religious beliefs which seem to be challenged by such philosophic speculation. Well, the dominant movement in this Age of Reason is obviously a group known as the Rationalists, associated with the famous trinity of Descartes, Hobbes, and Spinoza, but including others like Leibniz. The Rationalists sought to construct philosophical systems. They were systems makers. But what makes these systems distinctive is that they were meant to be designed on the basis of purely mathematical reason. That arithmetical and geometrical reason was the model by which these philosophers sought to construct their worldviews. And the result of that was a deep and abiding concern with questions of method. And an attempt, at least, to discover logical demonstrations for all conclusions. A goal of a purely rational philosophical worldview. And the model of that, obviously, as I mentioned before, was mathematics. Mathematics became, for the 17th century rationalists, the model of human rationality. And one of the implications of that were a growing affinity for mechanistic interpretations of nature. Interpretations of nature that treat the natural world as purely quantitative. The founder of rationalism, its dominant figure, was, of course, René Descartes, who formulated the central project of rationalism, with his exposition of the rational method of inquiry, which consisted of systematic doubt of all propositions, a careful analysis of all arguments and beliefs into their smallest bits, and then a synthesis based on a very careful set of inferences based, again, on that sort of mathematical reasoning. And that method that Descartes established would characterize the thought of all of the great rationalists. Descartes' famous principle, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, served as the basis for the widely shared rationalist epistemology, one based on clear and distinct ideas. Descartes claimed that he'd found one truth he couldn't doubt, that he existed because he thought, and then examined the features of that phenomenologically, what seemed to occur in his mind as he held that conviction. And all he could note about that idea that distinguished it from others was that it was clear and distinct, and that then became the model of all truth, objective truth. Even so, Descartes' central concerns were metaphysical. And in some ways, despite the fact that he challenged much traditional religious teaching, he didn't completely reject that tradition. He was concerned to prove the existence of God. And he is, of course, the author of our modern dualism, a dualism of mind, which is by nature supersensible and phenomenal, and body, or nature, which is purely mechanical and deterministic. And as you'll see in the lectures, Descartes, in fact, believed that animals were essentially machines. Well, Hobbes shared much of Descartes' rationalism, but his primary concerns were political. In part, this is the result of his experience of the tumultuous English Revolution of the mid-17th century. Hobbes grounds his analysis on a very realistic assessment of human psychology and motivation, one which is meant to be scientific. The laws of nature, he prefers, proffers are purportedly rationally demonstrable scientific truths that can be established through mathematical reasoning. But his social contractarianism would offer a fully modern and obviously commercially influenced to think of society as comprised of contracts, obviously is a reflection of the rise of contracts in the great age of commerce. It is a fully modern account of political association that would have profound implications and immense influence from obviously Locke, who adopted the same methodology, to Rousseau, and even to such current thinkers as Rawls. Now, Spinoza, the third of the great rationalists, shared Descartes' metaphysical concerns, as well as his epistemology, but came to radically different conclusions. Instead of dualism, Spinoza embraced monism. And in so doing, he reduced the entire cosmos to the realm of mechanical nature. The result of this was an affirmation of determinacy that was both metaphysical and psychological, that not only was the universe determined, but so were our own psychological states. Now, Spinoza's view is obviously the most heretical of the rationalists, and for that he was considered a wicked man. But his pantheism and quasi-Buddhist ethic would be a great source of inspiration for many of the 19th century romantics, as his critique of revealed religion would be a source of inspiration for 18th century enlightened natural religion. By insisting on nothing less than mathematical certainty, the rationalists opened the door to the reassertion of skepticism. And the critical figures here are the fideists. Fideists used skepticism to argue that since one could not have certain knowledge on a purely rational basis, one ought to have resort to faith on the most central issues that face us. So Pierre Bayle dramatized the conflict between faith and reason to argue for the priority of faith. But there was an irony to this, because ultimately this proved a losing battle. Most of his 18th century readers, who were sympathetic to Bayle, interpreted his skepticism not as fideistic, but quite the contrary, as irreligious in intent. Blaise Pascal also stressed the centrality of faith in God for the most basic and important questions in our lives. What is our fate after we die? What is the meaning of life? And such questions of truth, mortality of the soul, and the existence of God give meaning and direction to our existence, at least in Pascal's mind. And the importance of these issues are highlighted in his famous wager, where the stakes are seen to be so very high in the question of the existence of God that we have grounds to indulge our faith, given what the potential rewards might be. Well, I want to conclude by talking about a figure who really closes the age of reason and heralds in the new age of enlightenment. And that, of course, is Sir Isaac Newton. The seminal work of Sir Isaac Newton firmly established the authority of modern mathematical science against the skepticisms of the Bayles and Pascals. And it also established the authority of the modern scientific method of deductive argument and experimental testing. Furthermore, Newton's adoption of the principle of action at a distance signaled the end of primary in favor of secondary causes. We cease to argue for completely logical demonstrations of the principles by which things act, and instead ask questions of more proximate and measurable causes, rather than ultimate and philosophic causes. We simply learned to stop asking what was the nature of providence and what was the ultimate cause of gravity. Newton quite sensibly said, I don't know the cause of gravity, I've simply observed how it works. Now, Newton, it is worth noting, was himself intensely pietistic and meant his work to be a celebration of God. Newton spent much time working on alchemy and studying the Book of Revelations. But despite his own pietism, Newton's achievement would encourage many, if not most of his admirers, to embrace not traditional Christianity, but natural religion or rational religion, and in particular deism, which became quite the fashion in the 18th century, and which clearly signaled a rejection of traditional Christian revelation. Newton's mechanics would give rise in the 18th century to a new understanding of the universe, not one governed directly by a God interested in everyday concerns, whose providential concerns establish themselves in military victories and earthquakes and natural disasters, but rather a new image of the universe emerged, one in which the universe was a vast clockwork. A clockwork designed by an enlightened and informed mathematical deity who simply wound the clockwork up and left it to its own inexorable workings. So while the Newtonian scheme may have required us to believe in a creator, it was not a creator who would then concern himself with the everyday concerns of the planet. And I think that gives us a sense of the remarkable trajectory of this period as Europe is fundamentally transformed, as Renaissance gives rise to Age of Reason, and as Age of Reason finally closes to give rise to the great 18th century Age of Light.